What if everything society tells men about marriage and fatherhood is wrong? What if the man who refuses to settle down isn't selfish, immature, or afraid of commitment, but simply making a rational choice in a world that no longer rewards traditional masculinity the way it once did? For decades, the standard life script for men has been clear: get a job, get married, have kids, and sacrifice your freedom for the sake of responsibility. Any man who deviates from this path is labeled, sometimes subtly, sometimes outright, as a failure, a Peter Pan, a selfish loner who cares only about himself. But what if the opposite is true? What if the men opting out of marriage and fatherhood are the ones who've actually thought more deeply about what it means to live a meaningful life, rather than blindly following a script written for them by previous generations? This isn't just a philosophical debate. It's a cultural shift happening right now. More men than ever are choosing to remain single, childless, and untethered to the traditional markers of adulthood. And the backlash against them is fierce. So let's ask the real question: is a man who rejects marriage and fatherhood truly irresponsible? Or is society just uncomfortable with men who refuse to play by its rules? If you've ever been a man who openly questioned the value of marriage or children, you've probably heard some version of the same criticisms. You're just afraid of commitment. You'll regret it when you're old and alone. Real men build legacies through their families. You're being selfish. Society needs fathers. These arguments aren't just opinions. They're deeply ingrained social expectations. And they all rest on one core assumption: that a man's worth is tied to his willingness to conform to traditional family structures. But let's dissect this assumption. The most common accusation against bachelors is that they're hoarding their time, money, and energy for themselves. But since when is self-determination a moral failing? No one accuses a woman who prioritizes her career over motherhood of being selfish. In fact, she's often celebrated for her independence. But when a man does the same, he's labeled as immature or afraid of responsibility. The truth: a man who chooses freedom isn't necessarily avoiding responsibility. He's choosing different responsibilities. Maybe he's building a business, pursuing creative work, or dedicating himself to a cause. Why is that less valuable than raising children? Another common claim is that marriage and fatherhood force men to grow up. But think about that for a second. If a man only becomes responsible because he has to, because a child depends on him, does that really make him mature? Or does it just mean he's responding to external pressure? Plenty of men become fathers and remain emotionally stunted, financially reckless, or outright absent. Meanwhile, there are lifelong bachelors who are disciplined, ambitious, and deeply principled. Maturity isn't about checking boxes, it's about character. The final, most emotionally charged argument is that men who don't have children leave no legacy. But since when is legacy solely about DNA? Writers, artists, inventors, and leaders shape the world without passing on their genes. If legacy only mattered through offspring, then men like Nikola Tesla, Leonardo da Vinci, and Friedrich Nietzsche would be failures, which is absurd. A man's legacy isn't just his children, it's his ideas, his work, and his impact on the world. At its core, the criticism of single, childless men isn't about morality or maturity. It's about control. For centuries, society functioned by directing men into predictable roles: provider, protector, patriarch. A man with a family was easier to motivate through obligation and easier to predict through responsibility. But today, men have options, and that terrifies the status quo. Because if men realize they don't need marriage or fatherhood to be happy or significant, what happens to the old system? That's why the backlash is so intense. It's not just about personal choices, it's about maintaining a social order that depends on male compliance. Choosing not to marry or have children doesn't make a man irresponsible. It makes him autonomous. And autonomy, the freedom to define success on your own terms, might be the most radical act of masculinity left in the modern world. So the next time someone tells you that a bachelor is selfish or immature, ask them, or is he just free? One of the most frequent criticisms leveled at men who choose not to marry or have children is that their decision is inherently selfish. The argument goes something like this: a bachelor is a man who hoards wealth for himself, greedy, miserly, and antisocial. He must also be immature, a perpetual man-child afraid of commitment, eager to avoid real responsibility. And of course, he must be deluded, because life without a family is supposedly devoid of meaning, purpose, and legacy. After all, what could be more valuable than marriage and children? To reject them is as foolish as choosing brass rings over gold. This criticism is often delivered with even harsher judgment than I've presented it here. But let's break it down with some counter-arguments. First, it's important to separate the institutions of marriage and parenthood from the values they're said to provide. Yes, family life can give men meaning, maturity, and a sense of legacy. But it's not the only way to achieve those things. In fact, there are countless paths to personal growth, responsibility, and lasting impact that don't involve raising children. Conversely, marriage and parenthood don't automatically bestow these virtues. Look around. The world is full of deadbeat parents who failed to rise to the occasion, children who inherited little wisdom or guidance, and people who, despite having families, still lead lives devoid of real purpose. Worse, some parents unconsciously burden their children with the weight of their own unfulfilled dreams, a role no child should have to bear. So, if meaning, maturity, and legacy don't always come from family life, and if they can be found elsewhere, why do so many people act as if marriage and children are the only path to fulfillment? The answer is simple: most people are conventional. They follow well-worn paths because they lack the imagination or the courage to consider alternatives. Take money, for example. Ask the average person, "How should I make a living?" And the near universal answer will be, "Get a job." Ordinary people default to employment because they can't conceive of other ways to earn: investing, entrepreneurship, passive income. To them, a job isn't just fav way to make money, it's the only way. The same logic applies to meaning and purpose. For conventional thinkers, marriage and children aren't just their path to fulfillment. They're the default path. They can't imagine alternatives because they've never seriously considered them. But here's the problem. The most financially successful people aren't employees. They're investors, creators, and business owners. Similarly, the most fulfilled people aren't always those who followed the standard life script. They're the ones who took ownership of their purpose, rather than outsourcing it to societal expectations. There's another flaw in the criticism. It assumes that becoming a parent will magically make someone responsible and mature. But that's like saying a job will automatically make someone financially savvy. It might happen, or it might not. Would we hire someone for a critical role with no skills, expecting the job itself to turn them into a competent professional? Of course not. So why assume that parenthood will transform an aimless person into a responsible adult? Sometimes it does, but just as often it doesn't. Wouldn't it be better if people chose to start families only after they'd already cultivated maturity and purpose, rather than treating parenthood as a shortcut to those things? Just as there are many ways to build wealth beyond a 9-to-5, there are many ways to build meaning beyond family. But both require something most people lack: initiative and imagination. Marriage and children are, in a sense, the communist pathway to fulfillment, accessible to nearly everyone, requiring little original thought. It costs almost nothing to have a child, just as it costs little to get a job. But creating a legacy outside of parenthood, like building wealth outside of employment, demands effort, creativity, and independence. That's why most people don't do it. The criticism that unmarried, childless men are selfish or immature reflects a narrow worldview, one that equates conformity with virtue. But meaning and responsibility aren't handed out with marriage licenses or birth certificates. They're cultivated through intention, effort, and sometimes the courage to walk a different path. So, does this resonate with your experience? Have you seen people find fulfillment in unconventional ways? Or have you noticed how often the default life script fails to deliver what it promises? The truth is, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, only the choices we make and the lives we build from them.